Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yes. Fabulous. I couldn't hope for anything better for my birthday, right? What else is there to do on a day like this? And some of you might know too that I gave a talk at 1 p.m. at the Art Institute of Chicago. So there you go. Thank you. So yeah, I'm doing what I like to do the most. Well, a few other things, but yeah. Let's get on with this, right? So I guess we can bring the house lights down. That's great. Thank you so much for coming. It's so great to see so many of you. I really wanted to do this, and I was so pleased that the Institute were kind enough to accept the proposal for Arte Povera, because I feel that it's so easy. We think Italy, we think many things, but when it comes to culture, we think the Renaissance all the time. We think about the glories of the past. And it's only when I moved from Milan to London that I realized, and that's the madness of it, I had to move out of Italy to realize that this movement, end of the 1960s, 1970s, changed contemporary art forever, not just for Italy, not just for Europe, for the world. And we tend to sort of gloss over the contribution of Arte Povera. Certainly in Italy, we don't really talk about the influence of Arte Povera across the world. So it was a great opportunity for me to kind of set this right, but also to use the next lectures to think about contemporary art and how tricky it can be, and how a number of amazing artists over 50 years ago accomplished so much and was truly at the avant-garde of what today is normal currency. Environmental concern, thoughts about consumerism, capitalism, the idea of ephemeral art, performance, the void, spirituality. It was all there already. They didn't quite invent all of it, but they believed in all these things with a fervor and a determination that's truly unique. So we're going to discover what Arte Povera accomplished for contemporary art. If you want to put these dates in your calendars, we're going to be here next month again to talk about materiality, and then again in March, wrapping up with ecologies, because yes, Arte Povera really focused on the idea of urbanization and nature, asking what is nature? Where is nature in the panorama of Italy, changing so rapidly at the time? And for those of you who are curious of what Arte Povera looks like, it can look like this. It can look very dry, it can look very minimalist, or it can look like this. It can look exuberant, and yet repurposing very poor materials. I know your Italian is top-notch, so I didn't even think I should translate Arte Povera, but you all know it means poor art. And it's not like a pat, poor art, what have we done to you? It's the idea of poor materials, because of course the history of art is all made of gold, silver, bronze, marble, and durable materials. And instead Arte Povera deliberately looks elsewhere. This is a work by Marisa Merz, one of the most important artists in Arte Povera, where she used air conditioning viaducts to create this abstract composition that hangs from the ceiling. Absolutely gorgeous, and yet challenging new aesthetics, new conceptual diversions from the norm to make us think about art. There are many artists in the Arte Povera movement. We won't be able to look at all of them over the next couple of weeks. You know that this week is about the roots of Arte Povera, because I want all of us to be on the same page when it comes to certain ideas that are so important to enjoy contemporary art more in general. My hope is that you'll come out of here today, if you feel a bit iffy about contemporary art. How many of you feel iffy about contemporary art? There you go. So if you feel a bit iffy about it, maybe, and I say maybe, you'll like it a little bit more. Because a lot of contemporary art hinges around these ideas and what Arte Povera did. So, ready for the journey? Okay, helmets on, let's go. Andiamo, very good.
It works.
It does. 1967. 1967 is when it all started for Arte Povera. And if you want to focus specifically about the movement Arte Povera and its development, many art historians agree that by 1972, not very long, most of the ideas have been put on the map already. Where does Arte Povera unfold? Mostly the north of Italy. Cities like Torino, Roma, Genova, Bologna, and of course, Milan, where I'm from. These northern cities really set the agenda for Arte Povera. And there was a man at the origin of it all, the art critic Germano Celant, that still works today, and sometimes he gets really, he gets very important commissions around the world. He was very young, as you can see him here, and he had the idea of contextualizing the work of these artists to bring them together into an exhibition in 1967 that was actually called Arte Povera. So he coined the term Arte Povera, and for that he gets, the title of the masterminder of Arte Povera. He also wrote the manifesto for Arte Povera. That's the importance that somehow art historians can have in the lives of artists. And it was published in Flesh Art, a very important art magazine still alive today. Those of you who are whose Italian is good to get to grips with complex texts can take a look. It's available online, not here because it's probably a little small for those at the back, but it's really fascinating. It really clearly states what Arte Povera is going to be about. You can see some of the works of art here that tell you about this aesthetic. It's very minimalist. It's very uncompromising. But I can tell you in a nutshell, Arte Povera aimed to reject the pop art aesthetics of America. There's none of that Andy Warhol, Lichtenstein playfulness with contemporary consumerism and mass-produced objects in Arte Povera. There's also a rejection of conformism. The idea is that individuality matters at a time where we feel that consumerism is making us all, turning us all into an homogeneous blob. And a rejection of expensive objects and durable materials. Arte Povera engages with these ideas of temporality because durable materials are the staple of what we find in the museums of the world. It's about power. It's about the permanence of ideas. While we know that ideas are very temporary, while we know that everything is in flux. And a lot of what Arte Povera wants to accomplish and acknowledge is this reality of the world, that effectively everything is in flux. And what we experience today doesn't necessarily have to be here tomorrow for us to gain meaning or gain knowledge from. And another important aspect of Arte Povera that I think it's so now is the rejection of categories and binaries. So they're actually out there to break all the certainties we had about art. And one of the ideas, of course, to use everyday materials and non-durable materials is to break those ideas. Break the idea of categories. What is it to be something? And what does it mean to enter a fluidity? They were already thinking about these ideas. They, of course, didn't care about the art market. They took fun. They made fun of the art market as much as they could. Of course, now they're all the works of art by Arte Povera that have survived are worth lots of money, and they're also in the biggest collections in the world. So the proof that even when you are against the art market, there's no way to escape it. If you become noticeable and famous in the art world, eventually that's where you end up. You get institutionalized. And of course, there's a search that is existentialist. And this is what I really hope to focus on over the next couple of lectures as well. There's something spiritual about Arte Povera. There's something important from the perspective of existentialism. In the post-war period, with an Italy that changes and a Europe that changes so rapidly around us, what are we? Who are we? Where are we going? And what can we trust in, and what can we believe? You'll see that the complex cultural context that Arte Povera emerges from is really fascinating, especially if you're interested in Italian history. Before we get to the Italian history part, I wanted to place on the map some of the coordinates. Tonight we're looking at the roots of Arte Povera, and one of their most important ideals is this idea of ground zero. Now, ground zero represents more than one thing. Of course, it means a starting point, nothing. But at the same time, it was the name by which many contemporary artists in Europe went at this point, the group zero, the idea of rejecting everything that had come before to begin afresh. And one of the participants in the group zero art movement was Lucia Fontana, who was Argentinian born and yet worked in Italy extensively. How many fans of Lucia Fontana have I got here? Okay, could be more, gotta work on this. Amazing. I know the aesthetic is kind of unforgiving, minimalist, but Lucia Fontana thought about ideas of existentialism, the idea of experiencing the work of art, not because the work of art tells you a story, but because it does something to you when you stand in front of it. It poses questions about, what is it that I'm looking at? Why am I looking at this? And of course, the slits. This might not be obvious if you stand in the back or if you've never seen one of the works by Fontana in the flesh, but what you see is a monochrome canvas that's been slit very precisely. And a long time ago, I used to explain to my students and when I gave talks that it's very hard to do that. And of course, it seems like I'm joking. It's actually very hard because these slits are perfect. And to do something that seems so simple, so well, without butchering far too many canvases, which he did at the beginning, it's really interesting. What he does with this is he makes a massive statement about representation itself. The realization that since Cubism happened at the beginning of the last century, surrealism, abstraction, whatever you do on the surface of a canvas, whichever way you turn that idea around, you're creating an illusion. And Fontana, by slashing the canvas, brings that to an end. He shows us the artifice of painting and poses a question that looks ancestral. It's like the origin of this medium that we call painting, but also what is the origin and the purpose of representation itself at this point in the history of art. So you can see the radicality, right? This is one of the ideas we have to get our heads around. Arte Povera is radical because the influences that Arte Povera feeds upon are very radical, and these are the influences that still circulate around today. So ideas that Lucia Fontana put on the map during the 50s involved the idea of space, language, and materiality. You can look at the slits as these end of the line. The painting has got nothing to say in the narrative scheme anymore. But in that silence, I can hear something. And what you hear is very personal. What you hear can be loneliness. What you hear can be joy. But the artist is not telling you what you should hear anymore. Arte Povera feeds on these ideas, the idea of nature and environments, as we mentioned before, urbanization, which tortured some of the artists involved in Arte Povera, a love for everyday objects that we have to understand. I'm going to show you where this idea of everyday objects becoming art also comes from, and the body. Works made by Arte Povera artists require movement, inspection, and a relationship with the object itself that goes beyond the idea of interpretation. So to better understand Arte Povera and why it happens in Italy at that time, we have to briefly mention this, which we will talk about more in depth over the next 2 lectures. Let's test our Italian. Miracolo Italiano. What is the Miracolo Italiano? Which I'm actually pronouncing with a strange American accent. My mom would be so embarrassed. Hang on, let me try again. What is the Miracolo Italiano? That's better. Okay. I have to impress the new director. Right. So it's a miracle, right? Yes, it's the Italian miracle. Interesting, right? It's an historical moment in the history of Italy that ran from the 1950s to the 60s, and it was connected to the economic boom that followed the Second World War. It happened in Italy too. What is very interesting about what happens in Italy is that it's very different culturally from what happens elsewhere in Europe, and that it's a very positive moment for the industries, for the development of Italy, for capitalism, for the general living standards. You know, suddenly Italians find themselves able to afford all the beautiful things that seemed far away before, out of reach, but it doesn't last long. And believe it or not, this is one of the best things about the Miracolo Italiano. Do you remember the lira? Before the euro came in and the lira was gone. Well, believe it or not, there was a moment at the very beginning of the 1960s when, hold on to your chairs, the lira was the most stable currency in Europe. And it was celebrated by the Financial Times. Financial Times pulled together a group of experts, financial experts, who decided that right now, in the whole picture, the lira has it. It didn't last long. But isn't that amazing? That's why it's called the Miracolo, because it was like, whoa, we still can't believe, this really happened. Now, of course, the Miracolo Italiano created a sense of hope in Italians, the idea of freedom, which is kind of similar to what other countries experience. This idea that the war is over, there's an idea of independence, emancipation. There's also with that, this idea that experimentation is now an opportunity, and of course the revolution. You looked at the dates, 1967, the beginning of Arte Povera, then you think at 1968. So we're not describing a heavenly place where there is no friction and no conflict, but we are trying to describe a picture of a place of hope. That's what Italy was. And it was a place where it seemed things were just getting better. But of course, it couldn't quite last too long. And when it ends, it hurts. And I'm not a historian of Italian history, but I don't think Italy really recovered from that. What happens afterwards, which is when I arrived, the 1980s, Italy turned American. It was all about American stars, American movies. We borrowed somebody else's identity because ours sort of let us down. And that feeling kind of already is present in Arte Povera, this kind of like conflict, this idea of mistrust. This looks good, but is it only good on the surface? So this gives us an idea. If you're wondering, why did the Miracolo Italiano and inflation? And apparently, with the rising salaries, industrialists began to shift their business abroad to get cheaper labor. The unions became very strong in Italy and unfortunately prevented certain developments from going forward. Unions not a bad thing in that case, but perhaps, little dialogue between industrialists and unions, and unfortunately the whole thing started to fall apart. And the divide between northern Italy and the south of Italy became more painful than ever, also leading to new waves of immigration and more unsettled for Italy, more in general. Now that we've got the picture, Yes. Okay, good. I'm taking you back roughly 100 years to the Industrial Revolution. What we need to really think about is quickly the major changes that made all of this happen across Europe. The Industrial Revolution had changed everyone's expectations across Europe, and among other inventions came this, the first photograph ever taken in 1826. Artists were shocked. Finally, the dream of some who couldn't draw very well to create images using a machine became reality. What do we do with painting now that photography can accomplish this? I know it doesn't look particularly well, but it's only a matter of time, right? Then the quality improves dramatically. And cinema, 1895, the Lumiere brothers. Painting looks old and sort of limited in its ability to capture the new complexity of the world. We would have not had Impressionism the way we have Impressionism, because if it hadn't been for photography, if it hadn't been for this constant pulling and pushing between technology, modernity, and painting. So that's why everyone during the last century, at the beginning, Picasso, all the other artists like Schwitters, Hannah Hawk, they all tried to reinvent painting by bringing in collage. It can't just stay what it used to be this long anymore. It's in this picture that this guy emerges. So we're looking at 4 artists who's influenced Arte Povera. The first 2 are French, the other 2 are Italian. And what I care to do is connect. It's important, this axis that runs between Paris all the way down to Milano, Torino, Bologna, Genova. It was real, and it was incredible. To me, personally, it makes my heart swell to know that the north of Italy was so connected to the discourses that took place where art really, the epicenter of art was Paris. There's nothing changing that during the first half of the 19th century. So, in a nutshell, now I'm going to sit longer on the Italian masters of the evening. Marcel Duchamp was a good painter, right? He started off real good. He kind of practiced his own brand of cubism. Now, question, do you like this painting? See, because you're a smart, educated audience. But at the time, people laughed at this. They didn't understand it. Look at the title. This is a nude descending a staircase. What did critics say? Nudes don't descend staircase, they recline. Poor Duchamp, he had to deal with this kind of humiliation. Come on now. People were meant to be open-minded in Paris at the time. They were jurying a submission of Cubist and contemporary art, and that's what they would say about Duchamp. So they were like, okay. When he came to New York, the same happened. This was actually laughed at so much in a review. It was called The Explosion in a Shingle Factory. Okay, you can call it that. I think it's a really cool painting. I saw it a few times. Really exciting. Anyway, he thought, okay, you're laughing at my painting? Well, get this then, and let's see what you're gonna do with it. So he gave the world the urinal. Now, the urinal is called Fountain, right? Fountain, oh yes. It's a big slap in the face. First of all, I have to say this because it's really important. The urinal, Fountain, has gone down in history as Duchamp's work of art, but actually there's a lot of controversy on who really made it, because many letters that have come to surface recently claim that Baronessa Hels von Freytag Loringhoven, who was, I know, I need to read her surname all the time after many years, created it. She was a Dada pioneer who worked in New York with Duchamp and other Dada artists. Dada is the name of the movement of which Duchamp was part. And there is a letter in which Duchamp says, oh, a friend, a female friend, sent this urinal to this open exhibition I'm organizing with my colleagues. And then the narrative somewhat kind of changes and goes a different direction, and it becomes Duchamp's work. I just wanted you to be aware of that, because it's a controversy that's actually important. But the work of art is stunning. Whether Duchamp made it or her, I hope we'll settle that in a near future, because it's important. It basically threw out the question, what is art? The reason why, and this is, by the way, a picture because the original one was thrown away, right? Yeah, the jury was like, what the hell is this? That was the point. Whoever submitted this, Duchamp or Elsa, submitted something that we don't attach any value to, right? It's just like the lowest of the objects, one of the lowest anyways. And it's made by a machine. It's produced in a context of industrialization. So it removes the skill of the hand. It removes everything else that we love about art. So what's left? An idea. This is the beginning of conceptual art, of what we have started to call conceptual art. And it's the beginning of a different kind of dialogue between us, the viewers, and the work of art. Prior to this, a work of art would tell you something that you should know through a narrative. With this, you're alone. This thing doesn't speak a language you know. This thing stares back at you going like, I'm here, and what are you gonna make of me? And he made quite a few Duchamp of these. So even if Elsa made this, Duchamp made the bicycle wheel, which is a lot of fun, you know, you can spin, I mean, you can't spin it in a museum, don't do it on my account saying so, but he did, the wheel spins, and he used to do it in the evening apparently, just go there and spin it. And the bottle rack, which is actually now on show at the Art Institute of Chicago, everyday object becoming art. How is it possible? Where does this crazy idea come from? Believe it or not, it comes from here. Do you remember this lady?
Oh, yeah.
Uh-huh. Some claim the most famous painting in the world. I'm going to shrink this because this could take hours, right? Mona Lisa was stolen. And when it was stolen in 1911, Duchamp got really tired. First of all, what happened to it? Overnight, one of the attendants decided to stay in because at the time the security was lax. And Mona Lisa wasn't behind a bullet glass like she is today. She wasn't like this icon yet. And then the following morning, this was the scene, and everyone was like, oh, what's going on here? Something is missing. Well, about 3 days later, they gave for granted that it had been taken, and Mona Lisa's picture appeared everywhere on newspapers around the world, including, of course, Italy. Italy was mad because, you know, Italy wants Mona Lisa back so badly, and the accusation was, there you go, the French can't even, you know, take care of our painting. Who was it that stole Mona Lisa? An Italian.
Oh.
Yes. Who allegedly wanted to return it to Italy, but then ended up trying to sell it to the Uffizi in Florence, which is a bad idea. Anyway, Mona Lisa was recovered after roughly 3 years of being away from the Louvre, and Italy wasn't quite keen to give it back. So it went on tour, you know, it went to Rome, went to Florence, before it returned up in Paris. Poor Duchamp couldn't stand this anymore. It was like everyone is like, Mona Lisa this, Mona Lisa that, and nobody understands anything about art, he claimed, because everyone laughed at his painting, remember? So he did this. Do you remember this? Little mustache, goatee, mocking Mona Lisa. Those of you who speak French know what that inscription sounds like when you read it fast, which I'm not gonna attempt, but it translates in, she has a hot ass. This is one of his jokes, you know, about the fact that that's why everyone cares about Mona Lisa. So the important thing about Duchamp and how he influences Arte Povera is that he brings the everyday object into the gallery space and says, this is art because I have decided this is art. It's a very powerful move. He takes away the power from the curators and the critics and says, I don't care, I am the creative mind, and if my medium today is a urinal or a bicycle wheel, here you have it, and it's your job as the viewer to make sense of it. So he's making us active. His request is for us to wake up, not to just want beautiful stories from painting, but to think about this object and what is this object doing. So the big question all these artists pose after Duchamp is, what is art? Can you believe that we had gone for centuries and centuries and centuries making art, nobody really asking that question? What is art? A painting, just because it's a painting, is art? Don't the critics start to quibble? Good art, bad art? What makes good art, bad art? The urinal. There. You'll see how this reverberates through the history of other artists who influenced Arte Povera to no end. So, first one I'd like to look at, Klein. Now, Klein is super fascinating because I actually feel for him. He was really groundbreaking and cutting edge, but he was mocked so much by his contemporary that he had 2 heart attacks. And then he died because of the second one. He had the delusion that people always mocked him for what he did, that he just couldn't get over. He would get very upset, and then, you know, it was the end. So, famous, of course, for this beautiful image in which he leaps into the air. I know, right? How to make a statement. This was actually part of a stunt. He ended up producing a fake newspaper which he distributed to newsagents in Paris on the 27th of November. This is the one-day newspaper where he put himself on the front page, very humbly. And, you know, it's an interesting statement about what an artist should do. The text there explains his ambition to leap away from tradition and to launch himself into a future. The artist of now leaps into the unknown and into the sky. And the sky becomes something that he absolutely loves as the resource of meaning, which leads him here to these beautiful monochromes. How many times have you seen a monochrome and wondered, what the hell is going on with this? Have they run out of other colors? Well, this is all about spirituality. The blue is so intense. This is, by the way, his own brand of blue that he will end up professionally and officially copywriting. And blue has a long history of spirituality that runs all the way through the Renaissance. It used to be the color worn by the Madonna, and it used to be the most expensive color to make during the Renaissance. Cut story short, it came from Afghanistan, and you had to get it, it was hell. And it turned, since it was so expensive, into the color you use for the most important figure in the painting. So Yves Klein brings this idea of spirituality into the mix, but he's cheeky. That's the nice thing about these artists. They don't take themselves too seriously. So he started to create multiple monochromes, which are already a big challenge to the audience, right? So you walk into a gallery and all you see is monochromes, all blue, all the same size. What are you meant to think? It's up to you. What does that color say to me? Is it spiritual to me? I don't know. All these works of art do is ask questions, and the answers can only come from you. However, the extra layer of fun that Yves Klein put into the works is that these works were actually for sale at different prices. Isn't that fun? All exactly the same, all exactly the same color, same size, but oops, they're all available for different prices. What is he trying to say with that? These artists have a problem with the art market, and they have a problem with the attribution of value to their objects, which usually comes from somebody else. Somebody who's evaluating, somebody who's critiquing the value of what they make. So they play along with the gallery to challenge the system. And that can be a little off-putting to some, it can be insulting to others, it can be a lot of fun. And I promise you, by the end of tonight, you'll see how fun it gets. He also created these works. We talked about the body and how Arte Povera is concerned with the role bodies play in art. And this has become a little problematic, and if you can imagine why, but naked women being kind of used as a living brush. In Yves Klein's defense, the models who have worked with him said that they felt absolutely empowered by the process, that they did so out of their own volition, and that they actually put a lot of input into what the work was going to look like, so they didn't feel objectified. The works of art he created through this system looked like this, some sort of primordial imprints. You have to think cave paintings, you have to think this idea of the connection with the body and the surface that receives the representation, and this sort of bypassing of the hand of the artist once again. Something a little bit similar to what Duchamp was thinking, you know, this idea of getting past this genius and allowing your brush to do the work. It's very fascinating, and some of these are absolutely beautiful. He plays with notions of abstractions, and again, spirituality, the trace, using his favorite colors. Some of them look as if they are a bit of a reprise of abstract expressionism. So you can see how Yves Klein really pushed the boundaries of what was considered art at the time. And I think it's incredible that artists like him today are considered so to be so important, because it took time for that to arrive. Many of them didn't actually see that transformation. You'd probably be very happy to know how important it is today. Another amazing artist that's familiar to you, I hope, especially if you're interested in Italian history and culture, is Alberto Burri. Now, Alberto Burri is a direct influence on Arte Povera. In fact, many artists in Arte Povera look back to him because he was the first to actually use very poor materials. And we're thinking about sacks, canvases, plastic. Now, Alberto Burri has a controversial history. First of all, he was a doctor, which is really fascinating. It's never too late to embrace art, and you never know where the inspiration is going to come from. In this case, it actually came from being taken to a concentration camp in Texas by the Brits, because he was actually fighting in Tunisia and was a fascist. It's in this concentration camp that he realizes that what he wants to do next is art. He feels betrayed by fascism and Italy, and he wants to start his life from zero. Art becomes the medium through which he finds himself again, and he looks like this. So you can see here how important to Arte Povera these materials are. You can see the use of canvases that at the same time represent poverty, but also this connection with the real world. This is one of the things that Duchamp had put on the map. When you bring an everyday object into the gallery space, you bring something of the real world into the gallery. And what that means is entirely up to you. Do you want to forget about that meaning, or do you want to embrace it? In this case, you can see that Alberto Burri plays with some suggestive quality, with the canvas that looks almost like a map seen from above, the clash of colors, this idea of textures that are not necessarily made by the artist, but that are at the same time carrying histories, worn out materials, materials that have history, that have a life. And not only played with canvases and sacks, but he also burned plastic. Now this is groundbreaking. And unfortunately, I would say don't do it at home, because this cost him dearly. He unfortunately suffered a great deal and ended up dying because of complications to his lungs, because he was burning. When you see him work, you can actually see him online. There are some videos of him working. He would use a torch on this plastic that was held straight between poles and then blow over the flame to create specific effects. So you can see the blowing without a mask. It looks all very beautiful and very artistic, but led to his death. What do we see here? Once again, this is abstraction. They look like landscapes. Some art historians have actually associated them to Baroque tapestries and draperies that have become ravaged by the events of the last century. So the pomp of the past that's completely lost its gloss. Again, everything is open. Everything is free, and it's a plane through which we can interpret our own experiences and our own emotions. That's the really important thing about Alberto Burri, and that's why he's so important to Arte Povera. But we have to remember that this is already the moment during the 1950s and 60s when he works. The world is looking. Italy is putting something on the map that is groundbreaking, new, and unprecedented. Working with materials that are absolutely unique, never used before. And then when you think you've seen it all, it gets better, because he makes the very famous cretti. Oh, what is a cretto? A cretto is a piece of crumbling soil, you could call it, right? You've all seen them in different parts of the world. In Italy, they're typical of certain regions, especially in the central part of Italy and in the south, where a creek runs and then it dries up, it leaves behind the cretti. What are the cretti? The cretti are this idea of something that has happened, a process of shrinking, which entails a process of swelling. They are the trace of something that was, and at the same time, they are an intricate puzzle through which you can see whatever it is that you want to see. Personally, as somebody who has parents who come from the south of Italy, I relate to these immensely, because I think they are extremely telling of this poetics of the everyday. When I said earlier, Arte Povera focuses on everyday objects, on poor materials. Arte Povera rejects the pomp of the past to bring in what everyone can share. Is not elitist in that sense, but I agree that you have to have been through a certain journey in the language of art to understand what it is that he says. So that's why I'm doing this with you tonight. So he made lots of cretti, Burri, but he made one that it's incredibly special and that you can only see right here. And it's actually a three-dimensional cretti, and it's in Ghibellina in Sicily. You can walk through it, and this is what it would look like if you walked through it. It's an incredible experience. And unfortunately, and this is rather uncanny because I actually, I started to put together this talk a while back knowing it would happen tonight. And it occurred to me at some point as I was refreshing my mind about Gibellina that the Creto exists there because the city of Gibellina was destroyed by a terrible earthquake that took place 52 years tonight, which seemed to me an incredibly uncanny detail. Unfortunately, 370 people died, but the town of Gibellina was destroyed to rubble. As you can see, there's very little left to nothing, and 70,000 people lost their homes. It became a scandal in Italy because it was one of the moments in which, partly because of the lack of communication, today we know immediately, people will be posting on Facebook, you'd see how bad things are, but apparently the state got news of how bad things were very late. So about 3 or 4 days passed by before the appropriate rescue teams were sent. And as you can imagine, that started to feed into the idea that not everything is as good as it seems. You know, it became obvious that something is very good and works really well in Italy and other things are not very well, and the South is left behind. So it was in 1985, after the site had been abandoned, you know, Gibellina was rebuilt, but in a different location because it was impossible to remove the debris. Under all those debris were the foundations of the home. So Alberto Burri came up with this great idea. By 1985, it was so well known that he could operate a project on this scale, and he said, why don't we just like remodel all the debris that everyone wants to kind of like abandon, and then look at the original paths of the streets and create a Creto based on the original footprint of the town. He said he visited the new Gibellina, and I said, I don't know anything about this place, I don't know what I have to say about this, but when he visited the old site, it really spoke to him. So remember, Burri is a huge influence on Arte Povera for the very reasons of the poor materials. He's really one of the early ones who brings in this idea of poor materials in Italy in such brave way. But also this idea of the body. Once again, this is something you explore and experience, that you have to be there. And this idea, of course, of bringing in the environment as well. What do you do with devastation that it's caused by nature and that nonetheless becomes a social catastrophe of no equal at the time in Italy? And we have to wrap up with him. How many of you know Piero Manzoni? Oh, we gotta fix this right away. Trust me, I still have dreams of printing my own t-shirt. I love Piero. Like nothing equals Piero. And it might be because when I was 14, probably 13, 14, a crazy professor I had decided to take us all to Torino, to the Castello di Rivoli, where they had a retrospective of Piero Manzoni. And at the time, we were all like, who's Piero Manzoni? Nobody knew about him because, of course, in Italy, we tend to be very shy about the best things we've produced. And you can imagine, as a 13 years old, it was all like, whoa, this guy was out there. And we came back thinking, what are we doing copying these Michelangelo sculptures all the time when this guy is doing this? It caused a lot of confusion, but maybe because of that, it was good confusion, of course. I have a soft spot, I can't. So Piero Manzoni owes a lot to both Yves Klein and, of course, Burri, but also everyone, we can say, owes a lot to Duchamp for breaking that mold and say, here's a fork, put it on a plinth, it's art. You know, he opened up the floodgates. What's fascinating about Duchamp is you can see here the connection between what's fascinating about Manzoni is that you can see the connection here between the Creti and what Manzoni calls an acrum. It's not quite clear who came first with these ideas of the void. You know, a lot of what Yves Klein was experimenting with, this kind of blue, was this idea of the void. What if I paint nothing? He even set up an exhibition in a gallery where there was nothing to see. Can you imagine people baffled? Say, what are you trying to tell us? He's trying to tell us that nothing doesn't exist and that there's always something to see or to digest. So the acrums are the very beginning of Piero Manzoni's career, and you can see again the return to poor materials. You can see how he uses wool. These works blur the boundaries between sculptural and painterly, and they become extremely poetic. Once again, the idea of an action that has taken place, this gestural idea. I dip something into chalk and then I lay it. There's something of the presence of the body still there. Then he gets funny. And when he gets funny, it gets funny. Look at this. It's a cylinder, and the title says linea, which in Italian means very good, a line. But the cylinder is sealed, and on the label it says that the cylinder contains a line of a certain length. As a 13 years old, I was like, oh my God, this is so exciting. What does this line look like? And there was no way you could see the line, you know? Do you get the sense of what he's trying to say? He's going near dogmas. He's going near this idea of hope, trust, and this idea of attributing value to certain things. What if there's nothing in there? But the label says it, there's a line in there, and I can't see it. And if I were to buy that, would you wake up at night, like at 2 o'clock, and get close to it with a knife? Go like, nobody's looking. And you ruin the work. The work is based on this tension that will be there forever, that you don't know. And isn't the same about art? Think about a Picasso. The real value of a Picasso, a canvas, $20, the oil paint that went on it, $5. Art critic sees it, 75 million, because it's Picasso. Art is based on attribution of value that goes well beyond the materiality, that goes well beyond the labor. As you've noticed, all these artists, starting from Duchamp, are questioning this notion of labor. Does it matter that I've slaved over this painting for hours? Well, no. Sometimes it does. It depends on the result, you can argue. But think about hours of work don't translate into great work, right? You can spend 50 hours on a painting, it still looks like crap at the end. There's no linear connection between the two. So all these artists are thinking hard. Do you want to see what's inside this? Or am I going to ruin it for you? There is a line. Did you think it was like this? I was surprised because I actually thought it was a string somehow. But that's probably because the cylinder is kind of like three-dimensional. I don't know. Funny, but see how it plays with your mind. Your imagination suddenly runs wild. What is the string made of? And if that's not enough, then it gets funny with this. Again, let's test our Italian. Fiato d'artista.
Artist's breath.
Very good.
What is it?
It's the artist's breath. So this is a balloon that he inflated, and then he affixed to a little plinth with, you know, a sign that says, you know, it's like Piero Manzoni, Fiato d'artista. Well, what happens to it? I'll tell you in a minute. Before we go there, let's think about the breath of the artist. You know how traditionally this idea that artists have to put something very intimate of themselves into a work of art is very strong, generally, in classical art. Well, what more do you want? The artist's breath. Do you remember when critics would say, oh, you really managed to breathe life into your work? So he's really mocking all that pompousness. It's like, really? Here's the breath, you know, in a balloon. This is what you want. You want something from within me to come out and go into this thing. Here it is. But of course, what happens over time if you buy it, if the air, you know, the air comes out and you're left with this smudgy rubberiness. It's happened to all of them. He made a series of them and they all came out like this, which I guess challenges the idea of preservation. You know, preservation department in a museum is like, just don't worry about that, you know. It's like, Manzoni came in? Yeah. It's what it is, but isn't that beautiful? Do you remember I said earlier, Arte Povera cares about this passing of time, and this idea of permanence is not very important to all of the artists in the movement. To some, they use lattice. Is that the work will be here today, will be photographed, and then tomorrow it'll be gone, it's fine. It doesn't have to stay here forever. The same happened with Manzoni. He was already toying with these ideas. but the best is yet to come. Because Piero did this. Look what a cheery guy. This is Piero in his studio. Oh, yes. In a toilet. What did Piero do next? Unfortunately, I have to tell you, he also died very young, heart attack for Yves Klein and heart attack for Piero Manzoni. He did this. For those of you who speak French, even easier. No Jesus in the can, no. Now, well, it's a little bit like the line. Is it in there? Now, let's think about this seriously, because this really sets the scene for, can you imagine Leonardo coming back to life? And it's like, oh, okay, it's 1961, and this is making people talk. So, oh, sorry, for those of you who want a little translation help, it's the artist's poo, right? Yeah, so the tin is meant to contain the artist's poo. The label is in 4 languages, so at some point it's gonna hit the spot. French, German, Italian, and English. And it was a limited edition because, of course, you can't go on doing this. Oh, but you could go on doing this all your life, I guess. I hope you do. It died young, yes. It was limited at 90, which is very interesting. And the way it was orchestrated was that the gallery that represented him rang up all the collectors and said, okay, we're going to unleash this onto the world. Do you want a can of the artist's poo? And what do you think the collectors did? Like, yeah. It's like, I'm just gonna buy the most incredible work of art ever made. But then the questions would start to arise, right? Think about the value of poo. I don't know when the last time it was you checked in the stock market. I don't think it's there. It's not marketable, unless you know something I don't know. And
fertilizer.
Yes, but not ours. Yeah. So what's fascinating about this? It's this collapse of the idea of value. Don't worry, Arte Povera will not touch this. So this is like the apex of a statement that they enjoy, the Arte Povera artists enjoyed, but it's very extreme. Think about gold. Gold is one of the landmarks of value. Definitely it is in art. So what did he do? He set the price of his own poo to the price of gold. It's not just a tin, right? So at that time, in 1961, when this was unleashed onto the world, the value of gold per ounce was $35.20. So if you were one of those lucky collectors who got that phone call that day and said yes, you would have paid roughly $37 for one of these, which is pretty cool, right? It's like cheapy artwork, why not? But, of course, the value of gold fluctuates, and this is where it gets really interesting, because now, this tin would be worth a lot more. We're looking at roughly $400.
Oh my God.
So there's already an embedded joke there, and it even gets better, because, of course, it's a work of art. So it's not just the poo that makes it valuable if you pitch the price of the poo. I never thought it was really going to go down this way. But anyway, it gets more valuable because, of course, it's a work of art by an artist that's respected, and it's in the history of art book. So I'll tell you later how much one of these really is. If you're thinking, I'm going to snatch myself one of these tins, presto, it's not quite as easy. But something very interesting happened in 1989. I'm sure all of you are wondering, is there really poo in the tins? This is the strange thing that Manzoni makes us do, wanting poo. If you were to buy one, would you feel sad that there's no poo in it?
Yes.
Or would you really want, I want the poo in it. I paid for it.
That's fraud.
Right?
It better have poo in it.
It could be fraud. So this artist, Bernard Bazille, decided to make his own work by purchasing a tin by Manzoni and opening it. Can you believe it? Is that criminal? It's a strange statement on somebody else's work. Anyway, do you think there was poo in there?
No.
Who thinks there was poo? Hands up. Okay, who think there wasn't? Ah, okay.
Well, there's something in there.
It's cotton wool and plaster. But fear no, we've got 90 to open. And wouldn't somebody like Piero Manzoni pull a massive prank and maybe make 2 or 3 real ones and then the rest fake, just to tease us even more? Some of these have been x-rayed, and there are reports of tins by him bursting. I know. Now, unfortunately, there's no clear documentation of these instances where people claim, I have a tin, and it just exploded, and it revealed the content. But you will read online. Anyway, the interesting thing is that Bernard Bazille's work is actually worth £6,000, the equivalent of like $9,000. I know, not much if you compare it to the unopened tin by Piero Manzoni, which in 2007 sold for $139,000, right? Which is not bad. And in August 2016, in an art auction in Milan for $308,000. Do you see the joke continuing on and on and on? And the joke is on the art market, is on the collectors who never wanted poo as much as they want poo today. But it's also about value. How we attribute value sometimes blindly, based on conventions, based on history. And this turns it all around. And maybe I think this might be my last lecture. I spent so much time on this subject. We did talk about pushing the envelope. Hopefully I haven't pushed it too far. This is in the art history book, right? It's legit. So, wrapping it all up, I hope I've given you a picture of how exciting the panorama of art and contemporary art in Italy was during the 1950s and 60s, that important connection between France and the north of Italy, and what original contributions Italian artists made to the international scene. These are all works of art that are loved internationally and that artists return to and think about and still try to wrap their heads around the originality and innovation these artists brought. So, in case you didn't catch those earlier, next month we're going to look at the importance of materiality in the works of Arte Povera, and then wrapping up on the 10th of March with ecologies, the relationship between nature and environment's industrialization in the work of Arte Povera, where they were absolute pioneers. On that note, it's been great to be here again. I've missed you. Woo. Thank you so much. Thank you.